Have you ever wanted to look into retro games but aren't sure where to begin? Do you ever wonder which classic games stand the test of time and which ones don't hold up? These are some questions that have been bothering me for a while now, and I think it's about time to do something about it. So I'm going through gaming's history one game at a time to find the best games of all time. Welcome to the Gaming Archaeologist. So instead of taking an in-depth look at any one game, today I'm taking a quick look at a bunch of games, specifically the Final Fantasy games released for the GBA that were either remakes or ports from older systems. I haven't been the biggest fan of Final Fantasy, but I figured that I'd be fair and give the series another shot. First up, we have Final Fantasy: Dawn of Souls, which consists of remakes of the first two Final Fantasy games. I did play a little bit of the first game for the NES, but I didn't care for it, so I didn't play for very long. The remake is obviously very similar to the original, but the presentation has been noticeably improved, and it's more intuitive and easier to understand than the original. It's also nicer to look at and to listen to. Still, I got pretty bored with the turn-based combat before long, but I did stick with it for a little while. I can't recommend the first Final Fantasy in its original form, as I think it's a bit too archaic and dated, but this remake is a nice little update, and I'd say it's a good place to start to see if Final Fantasy or JRPGs in general are something you would enjoy. Next up we have Final Fantasy II, a game that starts a habit that a lot of Final Fantasy seems to have, namely starting the story in medias res, or in the middle, which is not something I particularly care for. Instead of giving us some time to understand the world and get to know the characters before the main conflict starts, the game just starts off with the main conflict right off the bat. I understand that you don't want to have a super long opening before you get to the meat of the story, but skipping the intro and only later establishing things is rather jarring. I'm all for trying new things in storytelling, but there's a reason why certain patterns exist. I didn't get very far into this one before I lost interest, so moving on. Final Fantasy IV. I did briefly try this one on the SNES, and, well, do you ever have that game that you really want to like, but just can't? That's how I feel about Final Fantasy IV. First of all, once again, I just personally am not a fan of turn-based combat, so a lot of the game I find to be tedious and boring. But second of all, the story had such potential, but it had to give in to the same bad habit that Final Fantasy II started. The main character is Cecil, a knight who serves a king who used to be benevolent and wise. However, recently the king has started acting odd, and Cecil has been forced to carry out orders that he finds ethically questionable, and struggles with having to choose between his loyalty or his conscience. That's a really fascinating character struggle, but the problem is that it skips right to the point where the king has turned evil, and that's not where it should have started. Let us get to know Cecil and the other characters for ourselves. Let us see them serving under the king when he's still good, so that when things take a turn for the worse, we feel the weight of events just as heavily as the characters, because we got to experience it along with them. But sadly, the game decided to skip all that and opted to tell rather than show. Between that and the uninteresting combats, I just couldn't keep going for very long. Final Fantasy V. I honestly don't know what to say about this one. There's too much going on in the beginning, I couldn't bring myself to care about any of the characters, and I didn't like the combat. Next. And finally we have Final Fantasy VI. I already did a review of the original version on the SNES, so you can go watch that if you want my full opinion. As far as the GBA port goes, it seems to be pretty faithful. The only thing I noticed was that the soundtrack and some of the sound effects are slightly different from the original. Purists may find that to be a deal breaker, but overall it's a neat little port, though you're probably better off sticking with the original. So those are my ramblings on some of the Final Fantasy games for the GBA. Sadly, my opinion on the series hasn't really changed, and once again I have to conclude that it's just not for me. But at least the series does bring joy to some people. So what do you think? Do you like Final Fantasy? Which is your favorite game? Mine is actually probably the remake of the first game, as it's the most straightforward. Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.